As 2021 comes to a close, I just want to point out that we've now experienced 3 consecutive years of robust stock market gains despite some awful headlines, including the worst pandemic in 100 years. As we transition into a new year and think about the future, I think just reflecting back on what's unfolded and how the markets have actually responded is a great lesson in not only how unpredictable the world is, but how unpredictable financial markets are, specifically in response to what are generally perceived as very negative events. So let's get into it. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the end of 2018, which hardly anybody probably remembers at this point after the last couple of years. But that said, just real briefly, at the end of 2018, there was a lot of economic indicators suggesting a recession was imminent. Specifically, the yield curve had inverted, and additionally, the stock market, which is also considered a leading indicator, sold off significantly. You can see that up in the chart here with the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 bottoming out right around Christmas in late 2018, down basically about 20% off their highs. Long story short, going into 2019, there wasn't a lot of optimism in the market as the Federal Reserve had been raising interest rates. There were lots of concerns. But my point is, let's take a look at how things played out in 2019. Here's the full calendar year, and despite all that pessimism, the Dow and the S&P 500 both ended up the year well in excess of 20%. So 2019 ended on a great note. That carried over into 2020. There was a fair bit of optimism going into the year. The economy was doing well. The unemployment rate was at like a 50-year low. But, of course, that optimism quickly changed to fear as it became apparent that COVID was going to create a lot of problems across the global economy. The fear spread rapidly across the financial markets early in 2020 as we saw the major market indices down basically about 35% over the course of 5 weeks. This represented the fastest market sell-off of that magnitude in history. And just a few months later, it came on the back of the market sell-off. We saw the sharpest fall in gross domestic product ever. Of course, on top of all this, we had perhaps the most heated and fierce presidential race since the Civil War. So lots of pessimism, obviously, due to all these events. And yet, let's take a look at what the markets ended up doing in 2020 over the full calendar year. Well, we can see the big sell-off early in the year, but amazingly, both the Dow and the S&P 500 ended up well in the black for the calendar year 2020. So it was another pleasant surprise. So that brings us to 2021, which we're about to close out as I record this. But 2021 was full of surprises as well. Of course, the year kicked off infamously with the siege on the U.S. Capitol. Simultaneously, right as the siege was occurring, we were dealing with what at the time was the largest surge in the pandemic. And of course, as the year progressed, we saw major supply chain issues. I'm sure some of you saw these pictures with the container ships lined up out in the Pacific Ocean. The supply chain issues obviously have contributed to the highest inflation numbers in 30 years. So a lot of negative news, obviously, but once again, how have the markets responded to this? Quite counterintuitively. And as I record this, today is the 30th. These numbers are through December 29th. We can see here again the Dow and the S&P 500, despite the bad news that's transpired throughout the course of the year, we've just posted some huge numbers with the S&P 500 is approaching 30% for the year with the Dow hanging around 20%. Totally remarkable. Obviously, it's probably not overstating things to suggest the last 3 years have been full of surprises. But the last thing I want to leave you with is just think about this. If we go back to the beginning of this 3-year period and you had a crystal ball that had told you all the major events that were about to play out, however, you still had to guess what the stock market was going to do in response, what would you have guessed? There is no way you would have predicted that not only would the stock market be positive, but it would be well above the long-term average. It's been actually absolutely remarkable. So obviously my point is, even if you can predict future events, predicting how markets will respond to those events is an entirely different matter. And the last 3 years are all case in point. So look, thanks for watching as usual, and I look forward to talking with many of you in 2022.